The celebration in Kingston had barely ended when the phone rang. Andrew Holness, Jamaica's Prime Minister, was still soaking in the cheers of victory, and suddenly, on the line, was a soldier from West Africa. Of all the leaders to call, it was Ibrahim Traoré, the man who defied Paris, expelled Washington, and now was warning Jamaica. And here's the upside-down moment. When Holness thought he was celebrating freedom, Traoré told him freedom was already being sold in contracts. That's the twist, because enemies don't always arrive with guns. Sometimes they arrive with loans, leases, and glossy brochures. Before we dive deeper, let me ask you, where are you watching from right now? America, Africa, the islands, or somewhere else? And tell us, if it were your country, would you choose foreign investment with hidden strings or slow independence built by your own people? Drop it in the comments, we'll be reading. This is Legends by the Rivers. We bring you Africa's news, but told in a way that connects Kingston to Ouagadougou, Washington to Lagos. And for our American audience, this isn't just about Jamaica or Burkina Faso. It's about the choices every democracy faces when money knocks louder than freedom. So hit that subscribe button, share this with a friend who still believes contracts are harmless, and let's walk together into a story where reggae meets the Sahel. The celebration in Kingston was still loud outside, but inside Jamaica House, Andrew Holness leaned back in his chair, holding the phone to his ear. On the other end, Ibrahim Traoré's voice was about to turn from warm congratulations into a warning that no election victory could silence. Holness had barely put down his victory pen when the real test walked in through a phone line. The reggae outside Kingston was loud, flags still waving, but inside Jamaica House the air shifted. Because the man calling from Africa was not here to celebrate. He was here to warn. At first, it sounded like warmth. Ibrahim Traoré spoke of Bob Marley, of Marcus Garvey, of the island spirit that once shook empires. But right after the praise came a sentence that felt like a stone dropped in water. Brother Andrew, do not mistake contracts for safety. They can be chains. That turn alone would rattle any leader who had just promised prosperity to his people. The story then moved fast, almost too fast. Traoré claimed his intelligence intercepted a cable from Europe, calling Jamaica a soft target. A 30-year deal for bauxite, already whispered about behind closed doors. Holness froze, pen still in hand. What was supposed to be a season of victory suddenly looked like the beginning of entrapment. And if you think about it, most people know this feeling in smaller ways. Moments when a gift, a job offer, even a loan, comes wrapped in strings you didn't see until later. Americans especially have learned this through mortgages, credit cards, student loans. The deal that promises freedom often buys silence instead. There's a short story that echoes this. In Sierra Leone, a port deal was signed under the banner of development. People celebrated, politicians posed for photos. But the fine print said 99 years, a lifetime lost in ink. Families there now tell their children, don't cheer too quickly when someone builds you a road. You might find out the road isn't yours. Holness wanted to push back. Jamaica is not Burkina Faso, he told himself. The institutions are stronger, the economy more open. Yet the documents on his desk whispered otherwise. Contracts that mirrored Traoré's warning, almost word for word. And that's where the human dilemma rises. When reality starts to imitate suspicion, do you still call it paranoia? For a long moment, Holness sat still, the music outside fading into background noise. The man thousands of miles away had planted unease right in the middle of his celebration. And as he picked up the next folder from his desk, he noticed his own hand tremble ever so slightly. That night, Kingston was still alive with drums and chants. But in the Prime Minister's study, the glow of the desk lamp revealed something else. The hesitation of a leader who suddenly saw shadows in every contract. And hesitation, once it enters power, doesn't leave quickly. It lingers, waiting for the next call. The strangest part was that the warning did not end with Europe. It widened. Traoré's voice grew sharper, telling Holness that Jamaica's challenge was not unique, not isolated. Different faces, same game. Even China, he said, smiles for your harbors, not for your people. For a leader who had just campaigned on growth, the words landed like cold water. You win an election, promising new jobs, new projects, and suddenly a foreign soldier suggests every handshake hides a hook. Holness wanted to believe otherwise. Jamaicans are proud of building bridges with the world. Tourism, trade, energy, all tied to outside partners. And yet, he could not ignore how quickly the promise of development can shift into dependency. Americans know this paradox well. Most households celebrate credit as freedom until the monthly bill arrives. The human mind has a tendency to overestimate short-term comfort and underestimate long-term cost. Psychologists call it present bias. Leaders are no different. The story of Sierra Leone kept echoing in Traoré's words. A port deal sold as opportunity, signed with smiles and cameras, but buried inside was a 99-year lease. Entire generations would live and die before that contract expired. Imagine explaining that to your children. The land you walk on won't return to you until your grandchildren are old. History isn't just in textbooks, it's in the fine print people rarely read. And Holness found himself staring at his own pile of fine print. One document, one clause, one 30-year deal. A leader often lives in paradox, cheered as victorious outside, yet unsettled inside. It's the same tension many ordinary people feel when the party ends and the bills arrive. Celebration on Friday night, anxiety on Monday morning. He rubbed his forehead, torn between pride in his win and the unease Traoré had left behind. Was it paranoia to suspect betrayal in a folder? Or was it leadership to see danger before it strikes? These are the kinds of questions that never come with neat answers. Most Americans, if you ask them, would admit they've been told too good to be true at least once, only to find out it really was. Maybe nations are not so different. That evening, the sound of drums and cheers outside Kingston House was still loud. Yet inside, the Prime Minister's silence was louder. Papers on his desk felt heavier than ever, as though each one carried a hidden chain. And in that silence, he knew another call was coming. The kind of call that doesn't let a man sleep easy. Holness thought the night would end with doubts, but the phone rang again before dawn. This time, Traoré's voice carried no warmth at all. He spoke of names not yet spoken in Kingston, of negotiators smiling too quickly, of proposals that weren't simply business. They were traps disguised as progress. The unease Holness felt the night before suddenly sharpened into something heavier. Suspicion within his own walls. It's one thing to be warned about foreign powers. It's another to be told the danger is already sitting at your cabinet table. For a leader, that is the cruelest irony. You campaign against opponents, but betrayal often comes dressed as colleagues. And that thought alone can hollow out even the strongest victory. Most Americans would recognize this feeling in a smaller frame. When trust breaks inside a family or inside a workplace, the sting cuts deeper than anything from the outside. Studies on human behavior show that betrayal by someone close causes longer-lasting stress than conflict with a stranger. Nations aren't immune to that same truth. Traoré pushed harder. He reminded Holness of Sierra Leone's 99-year lease, but then added another twist, a Chinese development bank calling Jamaica not a partner, but a strategic acquisition point. The phrase sounded clinical, but its weight was brutal. To be treated as an acquisition is to be spoken of like real estate, not a nation. Holness felt his chest tighten. He wanted to dismiss it as exaggeration, yet the word acquisition clung to him like smoke he couldn't wave away. And here's where the human instinct kicks in. When a threat feels abstract, people ignore it. But when someone points to a contract on your own desk, With your own minister's fingerprints on it, the abstract becomes personal. It's the same way an American homeowner might ignore stories of foreclosure until they see the letter with their name on it. Then the fear is no longer a headline. It's a reality check. Holness tried to steady his voice, insisting Jamaica needed growth, needed investment. But Traoré's reply struck like steel. Growth without sovereignty is surrender. It's a sentence that sounds extreme, until you remember how many nations across Africa now spend more on debt repayments than on schools or hospitals. That's not paranoia. That's arithmetic. By the time the call ended, Kingston was waking up to another day of celebration. Music and cheers still filled the streets, but inside Jamaica House, the Prime Minister lingered by the window, staring at the horizon. The ships waiting to dock in Kingston Harbor looked ordinary to the people outside. But to Holness, after Traoré's words, every ship suddenly felt like a shadow of the deals coming his way. And the weight of that image followed him into the next conversation he could not avoid. The applause outside Jamaica House was still loud, but inside the cabinet room, the silence grew and heavier. Holness dropped the bauxite contract on the table and demanded answers. Which ministry approved this? Whose fingerprints are on it? The room went stiff. A minister finally cleared his throat, insisting it was routine. 30 years of extraction rights, explained away as routine. That single word made Holness's jaw tighten. It is the paradox every leader faces. When something outrageous hides inside the ordinary, when the extraordinary is disguised as business as usual, how do you react? For Holness, the unease only deepened. He noticed sweat on a colleague's forehead. He noticed hesitation in a voice that usually spoke quickly. Small details, but enough to remind him of Traoré's warning. Betrayal doesn't wear a mask. It smiles openly. Americans understand this in a different setting. Think of the workplace, where most employees say they don't leave jobs because of tasks, but because of managers they no longer trust. According to Gallup surveys, trust, or the loss of it, is the #1 reason people quit. If human trust is that fragile in an office, imagine it inside a government cabinet, where the stakes are measured not in salaries, but in sovereignty. And the unease didn't leave with the meeting. Later that night, the secure line rang again. Traoré's timing was uncanny. His voice calm, but his words carried steel. Paranoia is fearing ghosts, Andrew. What you hold in your hand is evidence. He told a story from Burkina Faso. A French mining firm once offered what looked like a 10-year contract. Harmless, even generous. Yet hidden inside was a clause that renewed automatically, stretching into 50 years without consent. Half a century of control, concealed in one sentence. This was the twist Holness couldn't shake. If contracts could stretch lifetimes with a single clause, how many of the papers on his own desk might be cages in disguise? He wanted to dismiss it, but the image of his grandchildren growing up in a Jamaica, still bound by deals signed today, was impossible to ignore. Humans often act as though the future is someone else's problem. Psychologists say this is why so many Americans undersave for retirement, because tomorrow feels abstract until it arrives. Leaders fall into the same trap. Holness leaned back, staring at the Kingston skyline glowing like scattered jewels. For years, he had celebrated those lights as progress. Tonight, they looked different. How many of them, he wondered, were already powered by contracts that served outsiders more than Jamaicans? That thought clung to him, and as he turned away from the window, he realized another call was coming, one that would not only widen the circle of suspicion, but stretch the weight of history even further. The most jarring part was that the net widened again. Traoré was no longer just pointing to Europe. He was now pointing to Beijing. They smile, he told Holness, but not for you. They smile for your ports, your harbors, your soil. For a nation that had welcomed Chinese projects with open arms, that sentence struck like a quiet explosion. Holness wanted to argue. Jamaica has long prided itself on building partnerships across the world: tourism, trade, infrastructure. Yet as Traoré spoke, the pride began to feel like vulnerability. And here lies the contradiction. What looks like growth on the surface can sometimes look like surrender in the fine print. It's the same way most Americans celebrate when a new shopping mall rises in their town, until they realize every dollar spent flows to foreign ownership while local businesses shutter. On paper, progress. In reality, dependency. Then came another revelation. Traoré claimed his network had intercepted a memorandum from a Chinese development bank. Jamaica, the document said, was a strategic acquisition point. The phrase was chilling. To be listed not as a partner, but as an acquisition, is to be spoken of like property, not sovereignty. Holness felt the word echo inside his chest. Acquisition point. Two words that could reduce a nation's spirit to a transaction. And here's where the human side sharpens the edge. People can tolerate outside influence when it feels like partnership, but the moment they feel like pawns, resentment grows. You see this in workplaces. When employees sense they're being used rather than valued, productivity collapses. Studies show that disengaged workers cost U.S. companies hundreds of billions a year. If individuals recoil at exploitation, why would nations be any different? Holness tried to steady him off, insisting Jamaica needed investment. Roads don't build themselves. Jobs don't appear from thin air. Yet Traoré's reply was unflinching. Growth without sovereignty is surrender. And the line hung there, like a hammer against steel. For Holness, the weight wasn't just in the words. It was in the faces outside, the youths waving flags, the families celebrating in the streets. What would they think if they knew contracts on his desk could bind their bar longer than a lifetime? As the call ended, Holness found himself staring again at the Kingston harbor. Cargo ships floated on the horizon, lights flickering against the sea. To the public, they looked like symbols of commerce. But to a prime minister hearing Traoré's warnings, they now looked like shadows of powers waiting to dock. And that image stayed with him, carrying over into the night, when the next voice on the line would not only confirm his fears, but add a new layer of unease he had not yet imagined. It was past midnight when the last call came, and the contradiction could not have been sharper. Outside, Kingston pulsed with music and celebration. Inside, Holness sat in silence, staring at folders that no longer looked like opportunities, but like traps. Traoré's voice cut through the night with yet another warning, this time from Washington itself. Jamaica, he said, was being monitored not as a sovereign partner, but as a market to be managed. For a leader who had just won a mandate, the idea of being managed like merchandise was more unsettling than any street protest could ever be. This is where the unease becomes heavier than politics. It's not just about contracts or ports. It's about identity. When a country is spoken of as a prize, the people inside it begin to wonder if their victories are truly their own. Americans can recognize this tension. Most surveys show that when people feel like numbers on a corporate balance sheet rather than citizens in a community, their trust in institutions collapses. Nations can experience that same fracture when citizens suspect their government is trading dignity for loans. Traoré pushed further, reminding Holness that history's chains were not always made of iron. They can be legal, financial, invisible. Do not confuse applause with loyalty, he said. Do not confuse loans with love. For Holness, those words landed with the same weight as Marley's famous line, "None but ourselves can free our minds." And perhaps that's why the warning cut so deep. It echoed Jamaica's own story of resistance. A short memory from Africa made the warning even sharper. In one West African nation, a single contract signed in the early 2000s handed a foreign company control of gold mines for nearly half a century. Politicians celebrated at the time, smiling for cameras. But today, Villagers living near those mines tell their children that the gold beneath their feet does not belong to them. That kind of story doesn't fade. It becomes folklore of betrayal. Holness paced the room, trying to balance pride with fear. If he trusted Traoré too much, he risked paranoia. If he ignored him, he risked servitude. This is the human dilemma. Most people hesitate when forced to choose between short-term comfort and long-term sovereignty. Studies of American consumers show that even when warned about debt traps, many still sign for the loan because the promise of today outweighs the shadow of tomorrow. Leaders, despite their titles, are just as human. The call ended, but the unease did not. Holness stood at the window, looking at the Caribbean Sea. Ships blinked on the horizon, ordinary to everyone else, but to him, they now looked like floating contracts, waiting to anchor. And in that moment, victory no longer felt like triumph. It felt like a crossroads, one where every handshake might be a chain, and every decision might define not just his career, but the island's very freedom. The strangest thing about that week in Kingston was that victory never truly felt like victory. The streets were filled with flags, drums, and reggae beats, yet inside the Prime Minister's office, the air was heavier than smoke. Holness had won an election, but every contract on his desk now looked like a chain. And the irony is hard to ignore. The moment of greatest triumph can also be the moment of greatest doubt. Traoré's voice lingered long after the calls ended. His warnings weren't dressed in diplomacy. They were dressed in blunt history. He reminded Holness that enemies don't always carry weapons. Sometimes they arrive with pens. For a country that once broke iron chains, the thought of signing new ones, legal, financial, invisible, felt like betrayal of its own ancestors. And that paradox raises a quiet question. How many nations today celebrate sovereignty on paper while selling it in practice? Most Americans know this tension in everyday life. We celebrate the joy of buying a new car or a bigger house, but often that celebration is shadowed by the monthly bill that follows. Psychologists say this is why debt culture thrives, because humans are wired to chase the high of now, even if tomorrow carries the weight. Leaders are not immune. They make the same trade-offs, only the stakes are measured in generations. A villager in Sierra Leone once summed it up better than any diplomat. Asked about the 99-year lease on his port, he said, "They told us it was progress, but my grandchildren will still be paying for it when I am gone." That one line carries more truth than pages of legal clauses. It's the kind of story that explains why Traoré's warnings hit so hard in Jamaica. So where does that leave us? On one side, the promise of growth, glittering with foreign money. On the other, the fear that growth without sovereignty is just surrender wearing a suit. Maybe the bigger question isn't about Jamaica at all. Maybe it's about every nation small enough to be called a target and big enough to be called a prize. And perhaps it's also about people, whether in Africa, America, or the Caribbean, who wonder if the choices made today will free their children or bind them. What about you? If you were in Holness's seat, would you take the deal for jobs now or risk waiting to build slowly on your own terms? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear your perspective. This is Legends by the Rivers. If you've made it this far, don't forget to subscribe. Share this story with someone who still believes contracts are harmless, and join us again for the next chapter. Because the next story waiting for us is no less unsettling. A deal so shocking it nearly sold half a nation's gold mines before anyone realized the price. And when that truth comes out, the meaning of sovereignty will feel even heavier.